This episode is brought to you by Ghost Patch. Ghost Patch is a law enforcement-owned and operated company specializing in patches, coins, and flex shields. Quality is top priority with low prices. They always offer free design work and never charge mold or setup fees. Stop letting the big companies rip you off and check out Ghost Patch at ghostpatch.com and ghostpatchcustom.com. Now to the next story.
People always ask, is there a piece of evidence that provides more value than another? And one of the main arguments is usually, is DNA better than fingerprints, or is fingerprints better than DNA? And it is all very much subjective to the case at hand. And I think that really is what is very important about the field of forensics and crime scene, latent firearm examination, is that, again, we're not there to tell you the value of the evidence in the investigation. We're there to tell you what the results are. Most of what we're really focusing on in our field is adhering and obtaining the scene integrity. That's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to uphold that to the best of our ability. And chain of custody is an integral part of ensuring that we can account for the evidence at all points in time, right? You don't want any lapse of what happened to this evidence or where did this evidence go, because then you have holes. The loss of Michelle, it was honestly amazing to see, DPD as a whole come together, because, one thing from being in a civilian is, I've worked officer's death. You know how the department reacts to an officer's death. And honestly, what we did not know was, how is DPD going to react to a civilian death who is doing a job alongside the officers? And in all honesty, I think DPD set the standard for the treatment of civilian professional staff.
You're listening to the ATO Bridging the Divide podcast, brought to you by the Assist the Officer Foundation.
Since 1999, the ATO has given assistance to the first responder community. And now we want to give them a platform to hear their incredible stories.
We also want to hear the stories of the many people that support us.
Our community is small, but it is strong.
We have differences. We don't always agree, and we all make mistakes.
But together we can grow, we can heal.
And we can learn from those mistakes.
And together we can bridge the divide. This episode is dedicated to the memory of crime scene technician Carmen Fletcher, number T256. The early scientific method used in police investigations was called anthropometry, developed by Alfonso Bertillon, which involved taking detailed physical measurements of criminals to identify them, marking a significant step towards using science in criminal identification. Later, largely replaced by fingerprint analysis as a more reliable method. Other pioneers like Sir Francis Galton and Edmund Locard further contributed to the field of forensic science with fingerprint identification and the Locard's exchange principle, respectively, which revolutionized crime-solving techniques by incorporating scientific analysis into investigations. Here are some key points about the history of science in police investigations. In 1775, Carl Scheele realized he could transform arsenious oxide into arsenious acid, which combined with zinc produced arsine. This discovery led to the eventual ability to detect arsenic poisoning. In 1835, a former Bow Street runner employed by Scotland Yard was the first documented case of law enforcement comparing bullets to catch their man. Henry Goddard noticed a flaw in a bullet that was traced back to the original bullet mold. By 1879, another German, Rudolf Virchow, was one of the first to note the differences and unique characteristics of hair in the pursuit of individual identification. TV shows such as CSI made crime scene response and their case involvement become a household name, but also has blurred the lines in facts versus myth, and this sometimes can make it difficult in prosecution as citizens raised expectations on what we can do and cannot do. In 1888, during the reign of England's most notorious serial killer, Jack the Ripper, the use of crime scene photographs were extensively studied in an effort to detect clues and criminal profiling of the vicious murderer. Scotland Yard is the first to have attempted criminal profiling as a result of the Ripper's savage modus operandi. By 1916, a Californian was the first to use a vacuum to collect trace evidence, and manufacturing data regarding various weapons was cataloged. In 1987, the first case to go to trial using DNA evidence became a global event. It is up to the trained crime scene investigator to take advantage of every scientific and technological development in forensic investigation in order to correctly analyze, retrieve, and collect evidence from the scene of any crime. Crime scene analysis combines the human factor with scientific procedures and methods to interpret what has occurred. While the scientific evidence may speak for itself, it requires human understanding and voices to translate that evidence into a court of law in order to ensure that justice is always served. Today we are sitting down with one of Dallas PD's forensic specialists and someone who supervises our great crime scene response unit. She will walk us through their functions and shed some light on some of the facts versus myths of the job, and we will also show how vital this unit is to investigations and prosecutions.
Courtney Lozano, welcome to the stage. I want to welcome on our guest co-host, Major Swires. You're back to the mic, following up on the Richard Sherem episode.
Yep, thanks for having me, Joe.
Yep. Major Kylie Hawks, first time on the mic. You have both of these majors we have here have a unique connection to Courtney and the crime scene unit, and I think it's really valuable to have y'all in and have your insight and perspectives.
Happy to be here.
Courtney, you ready for this?
Absolutely.
Really?
Nope.
Not nervous at all?
A little bit.
Okay, it's all right. We'll work that out. I want you to talk about growing up. You moved to Texas. Tell us about it.
I was born in New Mexico. Didn't last there very long. We moved when I was about 3 to Austin. Grew up in Austin, went to high school there. Shortly after graduating, I went to Sam Houston State, Texas A&M, kind of did a hybrid program. Sam Houston offered research at the body farm. So I got involved in the body farm. Started there, absolutely fell in love with it, and that kind of was my my propelling going forward.
Body farm, I gotta know what that is.
So we place bodies in different areas and basically analyze the way that they decompose. It can kind of depend between what type of investigator is actually out there. So we have different professors. There is investigations they have law enforcement collaborations. The 2 professors that I did my research under, one was a microbiologist and one was an entomologist. So that's what I did my research under. There's also forensic anthropologist. There's other forms of doctors there that will do, certain type of decomposition studies or analysis of how the elements affect the decomp or the bone decay associated with different type of environment. So,
like weather, soil, and that kind of things that would influence that?
We did soil. There was some that would want to prevent any type of, like manipulation from outside entities. So they would create cages, allow the elements itself, the weather, to affect the decomposition, but then they would prevent animals or rodents. So they would build cages around them. We had shed. You could put a body in a shed if you wanted to do like a controlled indoor climate. We had an old Cadillac that you could go put a body in the trunk and look at decomposition in a trunk.
They have a big trunk, Cadillac.
Very big trunk, yep. Yeah, got to go with those big ones. Mm-hmm. We don't discriminate on size of the body, so anything that we got out there, you got to be able to fit. Ourselves, we did 2 bodies every 3 to 4 months, and we'd place them in kind of in a location next to each other so that you could evaluate how they would decompose in a similar environment, but with 2 different biological factors. So, my very first placement, we had an individual. He was probably about 500 pounds, and he's what we call a fresh body. So he had just deceased. His body was donated. And then we had another body. He was about 90 years old. He weighed about 90 pounds, and he was completely frozen. So we had both of those placements at once. And then we do sampling every 6 hours for the first about 2 weeks until the face decomposes. And then we do weekly, daily sampling of the body. So we did insect collections, and then we did swabbing for different type of like microbial stains to look at the succession of decomposition.
Is that so that have an interest in that? I mean, there's a lot of questions for that. So what drew you to that field?
Honestly, when I was in high school, I played soccer. I honestly thought that my life was going to revolve around soccer. I didn't really think twice about school.
You didn't think about 500-pound guy on the back of a caddy?
I did not.
Okay.
He honestly looked like Santa. And I just remember thinking, man, am I going to make that comparison of everybody to somebody I say real life, obviously Santa. Sorry if you're a child and you're listening. Santa's not real.
Carmen, close your ears.
Yeah, see? Exactly.
Carmen will not be listening to this one.
So, I think that interest was, there's a whole different world out there that I wanted answers to. And that's kind of what I was interested in. I like to ask why. I'm somebody that I'm not very complacent and just you tell me this and then that's the answer. Tell me more. Let me hear more about it. And so the field of forensics in general was something that really interests me because I got to ask why.
In a lot of cases, you get the answer to that why.
Right. And, the body farm was really interesting because we weren't told anything about the individual. Everything about their personal life, the way that they actually died was completely confidential. So it was really interesting to kind of try to formulate, and you're trying to evaluate somebody's lifestyles of how that's affecting decomposition. We would get somebody and you'd be like, okay, I think this person might have a disease, the way that they're decomposing compared to this individual next to them. Who
like comorbidities could play a factor. Okay.
Yeah. So it was really interesting to see that aspect of it. Whereas, in our field, we have a little bit more information. But in that initial field into the research, it was, I don't know anything about this person. The only thing we're allowed to be told was if they had a airborne disease, right, whenever they were placed, just so that we were cautious of it, and that was it.
So getting these bodies and not having any clue of what could have led to their circumstance, you had to just basically assess everything. And how hard was that to decipher what you were given? And you're learning something new yourself, but can you walk us through that?
I think what was really interesting about the whole process is that we weren't there to dictate or to determine how this person lived their life and what ultimately led to their death. What we were looking at was a very subjective fact about how they're decomposing. So we weren't really there to make assumptions. And so I think that made it easier, is because kind of in the field of forensics is everything we're doing is based on the truth. We're not really interested in how the facts might affect somebody positively or negatively. We're just there to interpret and to present the facts. And I think that kind of really set the standards for me getting into this field, is looking at these individuals who are very vulnerable, right? I mean, they're past the stage of life. Their hands are in us. We're completely in control of everything that's associated with them at this point forward. And then we're there just to learn from them. And I think that was really good for me moving into this field, was to see that it truly doesn't really matter the facts in our case, what happened before, because we're just there to interpret the facts that happened after. And I think that was a really good stepping stone for me to move into this field.
We're going to get into how you process this and from a wellness standpoint later on, but being so young, and do you recall how that affected you, and how'd you kind of wrestle with that? Like there was a human that once had life and now they don't, and now that we're studying this for my education.
I mean, definitely you remove yourself from the emotional aspect of it. You really have to think of it as science and not as of a life. That's something that is pretty big, even on our scenes when we're processing scenes, is, the more removed I can be from knowing the victim, the easier it is for me to process the scene. So it kind of is that emotional detachment and that really stemmed, and it helped me with the body farm, was understand that, I guess at the body farm, it was, we weren't really there to seek justice. We were there to potentially provide information that could later assist in different type of investigations. But, now with the investigation role, it's really, what does this body as a piece of evidence tell us in relation to the crime? It could be a living, it could be a deceased individual. It doesn't really matter. There's still a piece of a puzzle that we're trying to put together to solve.
I want to get into you starting at the Orange County Sheriff's Office. How did that go?
It was a amazing department. I worked under some really great supervisors, 3 in particular at the time. Ronald Murdoch, he was my immediate supervisor that hired. And then I had an assistant supervisor named Michael Vincent and another one named Kelly Wood. And they were truly the type of supervisors that you want to work for because they were very hands-on. If there was information that was able to be shared or taught, they wanted to be part of that. We worked some very high-profile, very sensitive cases, and they were always there by our side. We were never really left alone, and I think it was a really great agency for me to start off as because they really valued education and training there, and they really wanted to put everybody at the forefront of the field of forensics.
What's the size of that agency?
They're about, now you're going to put me on the spot. I want to say...
You've been on the spot since you've been sitting there.
Yeah. Yeah, but now this is like factual numbers. Maybe around 1,000 to 1,500.
Sworn.
And
then probably another 500.
Yeah,
okay.
Roughly.
That's a good size. That's a very good
Yeah,
size
I mean,
department.
the sheriff's office in Florida was situated a little bit different than the agencies are in Texas. So the sheriff's office had a larger jurisdiction than the city did.
So one thing I will say, after working around you in the field, I can see a lot of the traits you described in those supervisors in you.
Then they kind of have molded me. It's, they've kind of taught me that if I'm not willing to do it myself, I can't have the expectation from my staff to do the same thing. And they truly have been there to kind of facilitate that mindset for me. And that's something that, I want to instill on everybody ultimately. But really they helped me kind of create that base of, how I want to lead and how I want to go forward in this field.
Well,
and I'll say, after working a lot of scenes with Courtney, that you do see that when she comes out and takes control of a crime scene, she's down on the ground collecting evidence along with everyone else. I mean, she doesn't stand back and tell people what to do. She's instructing and she's doing it and she's a part of it. So it's amazing to watch.
Well, yeah, both of y'all have worked so closely with her and seen her work. I have not. But just seeing her, how she's been in the office, and also I have seen many photos of you out in the field from, Fox 4 Terry's always seems to be out y'all seen.
Yes,
but
he does.
You're out there collecting the evidence and you're actually in a supervisory role, but you're out there getting into it.
Yeah, and I think it really kind of helps set the stage because this is a very sensitive area to work in, right? You're working long hours, you're working very difficult scenes, both most physically and emotionally, right? And I think having that support is just a little bit added for them taking calls. And again, if I have an expectation, I should also be able to be held to that exact same standard of the expectation I'm setting forth.
So Orange County, how did you end up in Texas, Dallas PD?
So when I was in Florida, my husband and I, we had a little girl. Her name's Parker. She is my mini-me, exactly like me, which is very scary for everybody involved. But we didn't have any family. So we knew that we wanted to move back towards Texas, kind of get a little bit closer if we could. And so when an opportunity came with Dallas PD, we really wanted to take advantage of it. It was kind of not I was seeking out Dallas, but when it came up, it's why not Dallas?
What reputation did Dallas have from the outside looking in as far as this particular field that you knew of at that point?
Honestly, I really didn't know too much at the time. The biggest thing is when you look at a large agency, you normally kind of have this association with, they have a large amount of crime. They are able to handle the large volume of crime. And, from a forensic standpoint, if I'm able to be tested, multiple times to my knowledge, that's kind of what interests me is, Orange County had a good amount of crime. The way that we process scenes, we did this kind of stuff. We had a good amount of crime, but, ultimately you look at that crime and then you think, okay, if I can apply it to a large scale like Dallas, I really am putting my education, my training to the test.
Did you ever think about actually joining the police department to do this?
So I make a joke that if I was a police officer, there would be an officer involved shooting every day, because I think I would just be terrified. The job that police officers do, they truly have a special part in the community. And I don't think that place is for me.
So is it common for non-sworn to take the role that you have now in other departments? I'm not very well versed in other departments.
So overall, the movement is moving from sworn to civilian. So at my former agency, by the time I had gotten there, we had already made the whole transition. So we no longer had any sworn in our unit. A lot of the surrounding agencies had also made the transition. There were some agencies on the East Coast that were still sworn, but for the most part in Florida, it had become completely civilized. A lot of areas, like very, very far north, has a lot of sworn, and then a lot of the agencies in the Texas region is still sworn, kind of having that hybrid. But for the most part in Florida, they really moved to that civilianization.
Did you watch that show Dexter?
Yes, I did.
Okay, well, Dexter was Miami Metro-Dade crime scene analyst. Mm-hmm. I've got to ask, as far as like you watching it with your expert eye, what did you think of that show? We have a lot of listeners I know that like that show.
So it's actually pretty interesting because Dexter is actually trained based off of a real bloodstain analyst that lives and works out of Miami. So Toby was actually a technical advisor for the show, so he provided a lot of input from the professional standpoint of how to make this show a little bit more believable, obviously with the aspect of it being a fake show. And that actually has happened even in the show Crime Scene CSI Las Vegas. Grisham, the lead, he actually is mocked from a entomologist named Jason Bird, who is a forensic entomologist. And so if you actually look at some of his stuff, a lot of his pictures and a lot of what Grisham does in the show is based off of a real life forensic entomologist. So they do kind of provide that input for the professional aspect or professional touch. Obviously, some of it's a little extreme, but when he just like walks up, throws his gloves on, and then he's like, this is what happened, and they turn and walk away. That doesn't really happen. But
they can only fit so much in an hour-long show, though.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No,
that's fascinating. And you know what, honestly, like when we watch cop shows, we can see certain movements and we can kind of call BS on those. But then when it comes to that, I wouldn't know the difference. And I think most listeners, because your field is such an expertise and so specific, you would notice something much quicker. It would go right over my head. And I think most people too, and they wouldn't know any better. And I think, honestly, we're going to get into this too later. I think that could be to the detriment when it comes to fact versus myth, when it comes to what most citizens think what we can do and what we can't do, and what they expect, and the standards are raised for shows like that.
Absolutely. I mean, my husband hates watching shows with me because I always am picking out different things. I'm like, oh, that's fake. That doesn't happen. He's like, okay, can we just watch this movie or something? I'm like, okay, fine.
All right, yeah. So I wanted to really highlight your unit because you and I've talked before. I think that it is a vital unit to any agency, and it's vital to any prosecution or investigation. I want to break down all the functions that units like this and what your unit provides. So I kind of want to get into the different specialties within the crime scene unit.
Dallas itself, the way that we're situated is we're under now the forensic division. So the forensic division includes the crime scene response section, the NIBIN unit, or they call it now the firearms examination unit, and then the latent print unit. So the crime scene unit is we're doing the scene processing. We're going out, we're collecting the evidence, and then we're analyzing the evidence in whatever manner it is. So processing for fingerprints, processing for DNA, And then obviously if there's different types of evidence on the scene, we'll process that on the scene. Our latent print unit, they're doing the examination of the latent prints that are being developed from the scenes or from the items of evidence. And then our NIBIN unit or our firearms unit, they're doing the analysis of the firearm-related evidence, whether it's our fired cartridge cases or the guns that are collected in the commission of the crime.
Now, again, my ignorance here. Do you guys investigate scenes other than homicides? Because in my experience, it was mostly you got called for homicides. Occasionally, on a burglary or something, we'd ask for fingerprints. But the crime scene group, it seems like you're mostly involved in homicides. Is that correct?
So for Dallas, we actually have two divisions. We have a crime scene analyst and a crime scene technician. So we do respond to all calls for service for the city of Dallas. So our crime scene technicians do property crimes. They do our burglaries, our criminal mischiefs, anything like that. Our crime scene analysts are going to do all violent crimes. So sexual assault, homicide, officer-involved shootings, robberies, anything that is considered violent in nature or a crime of a person. And that's kind of what we work closely with our CAPERS unit, the crimes against person, because that is a lot of our crime that requires processing. Whereas, some burglaries, can be a smash and grab, or there could be gloves worn or something, and there might not require processing for some of those. Whereas for a lot of our violent crimes, there's usually an immediate need for some type of processing.
Do any of the you just listed off several units within the crime scene? Are there any to do the crossovers like that have specialties in both?
Not at Dallas itself. Okay. There are agencies that they call full spectrum, or they do from cradle to grave is what they call. So, some of the smaller agencies, Grand Prairie, they'll process the scene, they'll analyze their own latents, and then they'll do their own NIBIN entry into the firearm system. But, with the crime load that Dallas has, that division really kind of helps facilitate the timeliness of processing.
Major Hawks, you actually command of CAPERS, which can you just tell the listener that may not know you, because we got listeners outside the country, so just all the units that you are over right now.
Okay, so Crimes Against Persons Division has the homicide unit, Special Investigations unit, which investigates officer-involved shootings, death in custody, shootings with security guards. And then we have the robbery unit, the assault unit, the sexual assault unit, and then we also have victim services under the Crimes Against Persons Division.
Would be family violence, right? Would that go under that or no?
No, domestic violence is under the Special Victims Division, along with the Crimes Against Children's unit, which handles child exploitation, child abuse, high-risk victims, and sex offender apprehension.
And Major Swires, you were a longtime lieutenant in the homicide unit, and you got to know Courtney and that unit very, very well, correct?
Correct.
During the intro, Sergeant Dan Mosier, he was first time doing a intro, and I got to say he knocked it out of the park, but we hit on the science and the origins of latent prints, the importance of that when it really comes to any crime.
Right. I mean, people always ask, is there a piece of evidence that provides more value than another? And one of the main arguments is usually, is DNA better than fingerprints, or is fingerprints better than DNA? And it is all very much subjective to the case at hand. Having somebody's fingerprints provides a value, but if someone's fingerprints are allowed to be there, then what value does that provide? And I think that really is what is very important about the field of forensics and crime scene latents, firearm examination, is that, again, we're not there to tell you the value of the evidence in the investigation. We're there to tell you what the results are. The investigation itself takes its own course through the hard work of the detectives, even the first responders, of how they're initially handling the call itself, but we're there just to interpret those results. So the latent prints, me telling you that there is a positive hit of a latent print, that could provide no information for the case, or that could break the case, right? We had the case of the unfortunate college student who was kidnapped and killed, and what broke open the case was a fingerprint on the back door of her SUV, and that broke open the case. Now he's charged and is in prison because of it. So again, it's very hard to say that there is value one way or another, but if you look at a case like that, then the latent print evidence was an integral part of that case going to trial and ultimate conviction.
Well, and a lot of this evidence, no matter what it is, it could sit for a very long time before it becomes relevant or pertinent.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we have trials that, go years after, and then you have the convictions, then you have the cases being reopened. Even cold cases. I know right now we're doing a really big push for cold cases, and, they're pulling cases from the 80s. You're hoping that, in the 80s there was proper methods employed for evidence preservation, but, there's a big chance that there weren't, right? And so I think now more than ever, the spotlight is on forensics because it is so public in nature, right? The TV shows, everything's very public in nature. And so there is a lot of scrutiny of, the possible errors that could accompany those type of cases.
Well, there's been many. I mean, it's in the first ever DNA case. It was a global event. It was 1987. I looked that up. But even now, going back to the Jack the Ripper murders, they just come out with, they believe they figured out who Jack the Ripper was, and it was off a scarf that actually had DNA that was taken from the crime scene, that a person that was working the crime scene gave it to his wife. Well, that was still captured, and now they're doing testing on it. It's just fascinating. That is from the 1800s.
Right. And so, I mean, probably in the 1800s, they didn't understand really what that piece of evidence meant, but they just knew that they needed to preserve it. And that's kind of what is fascinating about this field. And, that's why I value education a lot, is because you're always going to learn, and there's always going to be some type of evolving nature with what is going to come forward. And you have to kind of stay on top of that. And I think that's what is probably the most interesting part about our field.
Well, because technology evolves, and you have to evolve with it and learn all the new. It's like SWAT. They could tell you all the new weaponry that's out and
right.
What works best, and breaching and sniping. But you have to be just on your game, learning all the new scientific technologies that are evolving, and some are in the even the experimental stages.
Right. And I recently went to a training, and one of the attorneys that actually presented discussed how one of the cases, they were a defense attorney, and they discussed about how they immediately realized that there was a chemical that was not processed or utilized on one of their murder scenes. And as a defense attorney, the moment they said, "Is this chemical available?" And they said yes, right? Then now there is a appearance that there's a failure to process, right? That there was a chance that there could have been something there that exonerated their defendant, and the chance of that happening, I mean, it absolutely could happen. But again, if you aren't up to date and trained in those fields, that's what they're coming after. All they're trying to do is just poke that hole into your investigation.
Yeah, that you have to look at inculpatory and exculpatory evidence, and they will attack it. We're going to get in later in the prosecution side whenever the value of testimony from your unit, because it is so crucial to advancing a unit and making it fall apart if it doesn't go well.
Right.
So you mentioned all these different functions of roles within the department, from the first responding officers to the detectives, to you have to factor in the chain of custody, and then in your portion of it, I want to get into the importance of the prevention and contamination of the crime scene for the first responders. Hey, this is your chance to speak to. There's a lot of young officers that listen to this show, and this is your opportunity to kind of educate and tell them what to look out for.
Just because, kind of a side note on this, we've actually been working for a while. We never have gotten it done, but we've been working on creating a training video for officers on how to best protect a crime scene. So that is one thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, even from, as Major Swires, Major Hawks, we're aware, is that it's a huge problem we have from the initial, and we understand completely the immediate threat of making a scene safe, right? That's not really our concern. Our concern kind of happens once the emotions have calmed down, once the scene has been a little bit more contained, that the events that are transpiring still. A few years ago, we had a murder, and I get to the scene and I look down and there's a rifle cartridge case, and I said, "This is beautiful." Right next to it is a huge spit wad, and I said, "Oh my goodness, the suspect spit shooting his gun." And somebody walked up to me, tapped me on the shoulder, and said, "Hey, the officer was dipping." And I mean, he was maybe 2-3 inches from our fired cartridge case. So now you've probably also eliminated the availability for us to do DNA on that item too, because of, how sensitive it is. And I just remember looking at the officer, and he just took off. He was gone. He knew what he did.
You just saw a 511 boot print in the blood.
Yeah, it was gone.
Trailing back to the street.
It was gone. And, I think, and again, if there is certain type of contamination or loss of the scene during the initial response, that is to be accounted for. That is understandable. But once you have that controlled environment and you have, chewing gum, and they spit the gum out, or, obviously you turn around and you're on a robbery home invasion and the officers are opening the door without a glove, right? Those are things that you don't really have an excuse of the immediate response, right? That has now been terminated. So now the biggest job is to educate. And that's something that, as Major Swire stated, that we're trying to focus on is, once you do your job, once you finish in securing the scene, is now how can we all come together and ensure that the scene is going to be thoroughly and accurately processed?
So one of the questions I'll ask is, do you notice when you get on the scene a difference in interaction between how patrol officers interact with you and how detectives interact with you? Because I'll tell you, as a young patrol officer, you go out to these scenes, and my attitude was always towards, well, we're here now. Now I just got to stand here and wait on PES. So you guys were more of a necessary evil in that role. But as you grow through the department and transition, you start to see the true value. So do you see the difference between the two when you're interacting with them?
Absolutely. There's been scenes that I've responded to, and patrol will say, "Well, I don't know if you're allowed to do that. We're going to wait for the detective to get here." And my answer is always, "I know I can do this. I'm going to go ahead and do it. You can let the detectives know when we get here." And it's not any disrespect, right? Because between crime scene and the detectives, we have that mutual relationship. But again, I think it's, educating and informing the officers the role that crime scene plays, and ultimately that is our scene, right? We understand that we have limitations with search warrants or consent to searches, but if that limitation isn't there, then that is our scene. And I think patrol I think that they're doing a better job, and I think that's because of the communication that's happening with the investigative units that are putting it out. I think they have a better understanding of what our role is and what we're able to provide. But I think ultimately, I think the communication can always be improved, and I think that's the direction we have to continue.
So when I was a trainer, I would tell my recruits the touch versus don't touch, and it was, if you plan on taking it to the property room yourself, go ahead and touch it. If you don't plan on doing anything with it, don't touch it. And I know it's far more complicated than that, but when you're dealing with new officers that have so much that they're already trying to learn, trying to keep something dumb and simple for them as far as either touch it or don't touch it, right? And if you disturb it, you pretty much own it now, and you have to process everything, and you don't know how to do that yet, so don't touch.
Right. And I mean, I think that's a great simple phrase to go by, because the thing is, again, we understand that there is an immediate need to protect the scene, but let's say that there's somebody deceased on the scene with a gun on their hand. They're deceased, right? Triggers don't pull themselves. They're pulled by the act of somebody else. So, as long as you have the scene secured, then that gun is not a threat. And I think that's something, guns are probably our number one fight is, that is a very valuable piece of evidence for fingerprints, for DNA. A gun can tell us a lot. And so the manipulation of it and the removal of it from a scene ultimately kind of changes the course of the investigation, right? How was this gun found, right? Now we have body cams, and body cams can provide that information back. But before that, it was really trying to re-piece together those parts that were missing.
So just picking up the gun and jacking the round out and putting in your back pocket's not a good...
No. Yeah.
Okay.
No. I don't recommend that.
So y'all
I was going to bring it up if you weren't, but
Yeah.
I figured it was coming soon.
Yeah, we prefer to not allow
frowned upon.
the gun to be cleared, because really that's all part of the process, right? Having a round in the chamber tells a lot about the story of the gun, whether that's a fired cartridge case in the chamber, right? Our firearm examiners can provide a lot of information about it. Did the gun stovepipe? Was it because it was close contact and it jammed, right? Was the gun malfunctioning? Is there a problem with the spring, right? It's very common for us to get a 15 capacity magazine and it load to 19, right? They're overbearing the magazines, the firearm weapon. So us being able to document that as is provides a lot of value to the case, whether it goes to court or not. It provides a lot of information, especially for the investigation aspect.
It tells a story, and it's all puzzle pieces,
right?
Really.
And we love stories.
Yeah, that's why we do the show. we do too. How do you document the scene as far as when you show up, photographs, the fingerprinting process? Can you explain all that?
Yeah, so at Dallas, we do photographs. There are some agencies that do video. We do video here, but most of the time, initially when we start, is we're trying to document the scene exactly as it was left for us when we arrived. So if there was any type of previous scene manipulation, we can document it. Patrol officers really like flares. They like to lay those out. Business cards, that's part of our initial scene contamination responses is, they'll lay out their gloves, their sweaty gloves, and they'll circle the fired cartridge cases. And ultimately for us, that's just us documenting that the scene was manipulated prior to our arrival. The best case scenario is we get to a scene, they secured it, and it was left untouched. And that is the best case scenario. Obviously, that doesn't happen every single time. And when it doesn't, then it's our job to start from that point and go forward. So with the photos, us just basically documenting it, and you want to kind of prove the succession of processing. So I want to be able to show that this is what the scene looked like, and this is everything I did to the scene throughout the course of the investigation. The expectation for crime scene is that, we have the chain of custody, that we have proper documentation, and that is what, a lot of times in the court is that we're being hounded on is how did you find this? Where was this found at? Because you have investigations and you have history of trials of people being wrongfully convicted. Stephen Avery, I don't know if y'all are familiar with that case, the Stephen Avery case. It was a Netflix documentary. And I just remember one thing that really stuck out to me was in the Netflix documentary, they talk about the car keys and how the crime scene analyst documented the scene multiple times. And all of a sudden, a detective walked in and found the keys sitting on the floor where nobody had seen, right? Does it happen? Absolutely can happen. But the fact that our documentation process is to kind of prevent those holes and those questions from existing in the first place, that's really what we're there for. We're providing that visual component that somebody that isn't there will never be able to see.
Well, stuff like that could put you on a bad spot as well, because here you have keys that says show up, and let's say that you did miss it, a defense attorney could show you as incompetent, and then that could just destroy your entire...
Right. And I mean, especially whenever you're not manipulating the scene, it'd be one thing. I mean, it happens. The biggest is our fired cartridge cases, right? Depending on the surface you're in grass. Now we have these ATF dogs that can assist us in certain type of environments. But, some of that is kind of expected because you're looking at these different terrains that are not friendly to the natural eye, right? You're having to look at it with light sources, metal detectors. But ultimately, when you're doing, let's say, like a search warrant of a house, it's kind of expected that you're going to find something when you flip a room upside down. But really that documentation there is to help prevent any questions of how was it found and at what point was it found during that search process.
I was just wanting to see if Courtney can talk about our recent use of red tape for inner perimeter, as well as the importance of notating who comes in and out of the crime scene as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of one of our big pushes is for our investigative units is, we have the yellow tape. So now we've started on our major incidences creating a inner perimeter for red tape. The red tape, people are terrified of that red tape. They see it go up and it's our immediate stop. You are not authorized to enter this area. And it goes all the way up through the chain of command. Our officer involved shootings, it has been a very important step to ensuring the integrity of a scene. Officer-involved shootings are very sensitive in nature anyways. Right, you're looking at it from legal aspects. You have different parties involved. And so ensuring the integrity of that scene is being maintained is probably one of the most important things that we can do for crime scene on that aspect. So the red tape really kind of helped us with that. We eliminated a lot of the foot traffic. We eliminated a lot of question of to who's coming in and out.
And a little 4-star walking up and trampling it.
Yeah, and they won't. They see that tape and they immediately think my name's going to go on that piece of paper that I was in the scene. I don't want to be called. And when we've had scenes where they absolutely needed to come through and look at something, but at that point they're being escorted. So again, they're not being left unattained in our crime scene, which is a really big part, especially of maintaining that integrity.
And when did the red tape start?
Yes, I just wanted to say that the implementation of the red tape happened probably over the last 5 or 6 months, I think. And it's after we had a brief. So we brief now after every OIS. Crime scene and capers, we get together, we brief. How did things go? Was there anything that we need to improve on? And so we walk through all these issues that we come across on the scene to improve the next one. What can we do different for the next one? And so we implemented the red tape fairly recently, and we've found that that actually has solved more of our problems than, any other thing that we think that we could change. That really helped us with solving a lot of different problems at the just controlling the crime scene.
Change in leadership with the crime scene helped with that as well.
Yeah. Have you thought about putting like the biohazardous signs up? So that'd be one way to keep them out, along with the red tape.
Skeletons.
It's Halloween season. No,
that'd be really great. What's actually funny is, this isn't that funny, but we had a really bad call where it was there was a lot of blood, and we had a major that was with us for crime scene, and he came up to me afterwards and said, "Hey, how did y'all, decontaminate all of your items, and like, are y'all good with that kind of cleaning stuff?" And I said, "What are you talking about, decontaminate?" I said, "I didn't get any blood on me." He's like, "No, there was so much blood." I was like, "No, that wasn't that much blood." And I just remember that mindset difference of, the way that I'm interpreting the scene versus somebody who's not accustomed to what we're seeing. And immediately, I was like, that wasn't bad. I was like, I just stepped over it. We're good.
You're like, I worked at the body farm. Get out of here.
Yeah, we got some nasty stuff out there.
So the collecting of the evidence is another crucial piece. Can you kind of walk us through? We've all seen the photos, and officers have seen the scenes where you have the little plastic things that like the Whataburger that they put on your tray when they're waiting your order to be picked up, so they're yellow.
Yeah, that's exactly what we use. Yep.
Yeah, the Whataburger. Can you talk about the collection of the evidence and the importance of that?
Yeah, so the evidence markers themselves are really there just for a reference. They're
usually numbered. They're numbered, right?
Yeah.
Why? How are they numbered, and how do you determine the number system?
Pretty sure it's sequential, and it starts at 1 and goes to as many as you need.
Yeah. Well, what is it like from the first piece of evidence, or like when it comes to bullet casings? Like, how do y'all set those out? And is the number significant?
So the number itself is not necessarily significant. The number itself it's really just a visual aid, right? So if I have a street with evidence markers, and let's say I got rid of all those evidence markers, would you be able to visualize that street with all the evidence? So if we have 100 to 200 fired cartridge cases, which is not abnormal for, a midnight or 1 a.m. shooting, are you going to be able to visualize the 100 FCCs that are laid out across the ground? Probably not.
One in particular I'm thinking about, and I don't remember if you were there or not, but the 4th of July shooting in Hamilton Park.
Was I there? Yes.
How many shell casings did we have on that one alone?
I believe I collected 120, and it turned the corner, so I was at about a block and a half. We had 6 shooters. I had 6 cars, and we had 5 people shot.
Did y'all have to borrow some things from Whataburger though? You ran out.
I actually just created my own for 100 over, but before we would just use paper markers or paper placards. But I actually went and bought orange cones, and I created labels for 100 to 200 because we started having to need them. And the paper's fine, but we had a shooting last year, or I think it was now a year and a half ago on 4th of July. And they got 644 shots fired. Paper didn't do anything for that. The paper markers were strewn all across the parking lots. They were gone. And at that point, it was there more just for location purposes. On that one, we did our 3D scanner for location because the extent of it was just too much.
Can you explain that 3D scanner?
Yeah, so our agency, we have a Leica. Leica is one of two most popular. The other one is a Faro. Kind of depends on what agency uses. But basically, it's going to be a 3D scanner that's creating data points of the scene. So they do the data points, and then they usually overlay with photos to create a 3D rendering. The 3D rendering, basically, you can it's a one-to-one scale. So if I need to take measurements from it, if I need to walk through the scene, if I need to do different viewpoints, you can do top-down. You can look from different angles and basically kind of maneuver throughout the scene. As a photo is going to be very stationary. It's going to allow you to kind of, the way the Leica calls it, is fly through.
And that is a fairly new technology, correct? I mean, like within the past 6 or 7 years, maybe?
They've been around for quite some time. So the technology really is based off of construction analysis. So that's our Leica is actually more utilized for construction. The equipment that's coming out now, our traffic unit uses Leica.
Yeah.
The advancements are definitely, the recent advancements are pretty profound on what they can do, but it's definitely been around for some time.
Go back to collecting of evidence, like when you run across a footprint or a tire track or bodily fluid or fabrics. How do y'all do that?
The overall concepts are pretty consistent across agencies. It really kind of depends on the limitation of the agency itself and their equipment. The fingerprint processing, those are your different chemicals. Sometimes you have to do manipulation back in a lab. Like a piece of paper. I couldn't process a piece of paper or a piece of cardboard on a scene. I would actually have to collect it. But if I had a shoe print, you're looking at a 2-dimensional shoe print versus a 3-dimensional shoe print. And you're looking, okay, am I going to take a collection of it if it's 2D, right? Is it a shoe print in dirt, or am I going to have to take a casting of it? So am I actually going to have to make up? They have different types of casting material. Some called like royal rock, some are dental stone. But basically it's the same thing as if you go get your teeth molded at the dentist. It's basically the same concept. Liquid, it hardens over time, and then we can take a casting of it. So that would be if we did shoe prints, tire tracks, but again, that all kind of is accompanied with photos. Everything we do is a photo documentation first. And
how much training? That you have to have a lot of training to get to do these tasks, correct?
Yeah, I mean, again, it really kind of depends. So Dallas itself, their training program is 14-week total with it. But, we do have still some sworn, but to come in as a civilian, you're looking at a minimum of a bachelor's with a year of experience to be an analyst. We have some type of education requirements that can kind of substitute. But for the most part, our analysts are looking at, they have a 4-year degree and they all have at least a year of experience in that field.
And you mentioned the sworn. When I heard on, it was mostly all sworn. It was veteran officers that had been working the field for a long time, and then they segued into that part of their career and photographing and collecting evidence and doing what you're talking about now. But it's different now as far as the use of civilian staff.
Right. I mean, we do still have we have 3 sworn that are grandfathered in. So they've been with our agency or our unit, for years. We recently opened it up to allow some sworn back in. So we just finished with our first sworn in training. He just got out. So he's out on the field, answering calls with us, but he went through the full 14-week training that all of our other analysts did.
All right, we'll talk about the importance of the chain of custody. Can you explain that?
I think most of what we're really focusing on in our field is adhering and obtaining the scene integrity. That's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to uphold that to the best of our ability. And chain of custody is an integral part of ensuring that we can account for the evidence at all points in time, right? You don't want any lapse of what happened to this evidence or where did this evidence go, because then you have holes. And again, in our court cases, that's what defense attorneys, they love. They want to find those holes. They want to poke those holes into the investigation. And if they can find it because, we lost evidence for 3 days, okay, well, who encountered the evidence? How was it manipulated? Where was it found? So I think, the chain of custody from start to finish, the same thing is from like a patrol. If they touched it, they're going to take it. And if they don't take it, then we have the chain of custody that documents that this patrol officer was the initial responding officer. He initially came in contact with it. He can state, I wasn't wearing gloves, and then we ultimately have that. But, what we're just trying to do is ensure that the entire history of that evidence or the entire history of that scene is recorded in whatever form or format that is.
In all these different ways of analyzing, collecting evidence, sometimes you're under a time frame crunch, whether it's departmental or like just on the outside. People want answers and they want them fast. And does that ever play a role? I know it doesn't speed up your process with science, but can you describe that?
Yeah, I would say, it's a difficult aspect because to us, the value of the evidence deserves its attention, right? We don't want to rush anything because then we are possibly altering the results that we could get, right? People make mistakes, right? We're all human. And the faster that somebody tries to process or to get those results out, the higher probability that there is going to be some type of error associated with that analysis. So, from our standpoint, we have our SOPs that dictate, how fast evidence has to be taken out. And that is something that I usually really, really try to hone in on when we have these special requests is, we can add this to a priority. We can make sure that this is not the third item that they pull off their shelf, but ultimately that item deserves its time and attention. Chemical processing, depending on what it is, it can take some time. If you look at best practice methods, you don't really want to stray too far away from it because then again, that's how you're kind of creating those holes in the investigation. So I think, again, that kind of goes to the relationship of the investigative units that are with us is, we understand that they're under a time crunch and we understand that there is potentially a piece of evidence that could give them an immediate answer. So understanding that relationship and understanding that kind of give and take is very important. And again, it kind of goes down to that communication is, you also have to tell us that this is vital to you because if not, we just process 3-4 other scenes that shift and we have 3-4 other guns. We have a couple hundred FCCs from our shootings that we worked, and so kind of understanding like, okay, this is a priority because if you provide me this answer, I might be able to, execute a warrant, right? And that provides a little bit more investigative knowledge than maybe something else.
Yeah, y'all have a great relationship with capers and I'm pretty proud of our departments from command on down to the investigative units as far as understanding y'all's role and what y'all do and the importance of it. As far as I want to touch on something before I lose it. How often is it that you go and process a scene, you collect everything, and time goes by, and then another witness may pop up or somebody may find something later on? Does that happen often that you have to go back out and basically start another crime scene? You may find a secondary crime scene or somebody may find something in a backyard and you have to go and start that process over again.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's too frequent, but it does happen, especially through the investigative process, right? They start interviewing, they start pulling cameras, right? Nobody wanted to talk on scene. They start getting video camera and they're like, okay, this actually happened down around the corner and ended where we, just finished. So something like that's going to change our course. Probably our most frequent would be a vehicle, a follow-up to a vehicle, which in some cases the vehicle is the scene, and so finding the vehicle a day, 2 days later, people think, oh, it's just a vehicle processing. But, if the whatever crime occurred, if it occurred in the vehicle, that could be several hours of processing depending on the extent of what is required of that case.
Some of the cases I would be thinking about would be like a body dump. You find a body dumped alongside a road, and as the detective gets to investigating, is they find out 2 or 3 days later, well, the body was found here, but now we've actually found the crime scene, and it's going to be this house. Now we've got to go process it.
Absolutely. And, then you start looking at the chemical manipulation of the scenes, right? So we're doing Blue Star. We're looking for people cleaning. One of the very first murders I actually worked in Florida was a girl. When we found her, we thought she looked in her mid-20s. We ended up finding out that she was in her teens, about 15 years old. And we knew that she'd been dumped. We knew that the crime didn't occur. All the blood had been dried on her at the time. And at that time, we call it community service, right? We're picking up everything in the area that is fresh and relevant, right? We don't know the relevance. In this specific area, it was a high prostitution area. So we were collecting all the condoms, we were collecting all the beer bottles, anything that appeared relatively in the area. About a couple days later, we found the actual vehicle, and it was a leather interior, and he had cleaned the entire interior of it. It was a pretty good cleaning job. He was actually about to set fire to it whenever they found him. And so, I think it took me maybe 10 hours to process this car in our garage bay, because we're doing chemical processing, right? We're trying to look for the blood. We're trying to prove that this girl was indeed inside this car. And you go to find out she was actually shot and killed inside this car and then dumped. But, having that evidence, that was our scene, right? Her secondary location was the body dump, but the primary location was the vehicle.
So collecting all this evidence and prepping it for trial, and the importance of your testimony, can you kind of walk us through that of like, how do you prep for a case and go over your notes, and you as a unit, because you may have different pieces of the crime scene unit, they're going to have to sit up there and tell their expertise on what they found and why they did what they did. Right.
So, our, the court prep really comes down to the attorneys and the investigative process as a whole. A lot of what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that we know front to back what we did in that scene. Where did we respond to? What did we do? Recently, we've been asked a lot of questions about who we spoke with. And sometimes that's not what we're always recording, right? Because you're on these very fluid scenes, but they want to hear who told you to do that, right? And that's little things like that we haven't really in the history of recorded all of our conversations, right? Like, this person told me to do this, right? It's a very fluid scene, especially when we're looking at these large-scale homicides where there's maybe 4 or 5 homicide detectives, the sergeant's out there, the lieutenant, and at any given time, we might be getting direction from any one of them because they're communicating amongst themselves, and then they're providing that feedback. And it kind of goes back to us doing the red tape, was to kind of minimize that amount of communication, because that's a question that we get quite a bit is, where did you learn this from, and how did that ultimately affect your ability to process that scene?
Have they ever talked about giving you guys body cameras to document all that?
Oh, I hope not.
You'll change your mind if you use them. I thought the same thing about police work in general, but they're so amazing.
Well, so from our standpoint, it's you have to have a lot of conversations about best practice. So a lot of what we're discussing back and forth, with the detectives, and I know that, the body cam can be turned off while you're not investigating, while you're having those conversations. And that's because those conversations are sensitive in nature, because it's not made to sway the information one way or another, but the conversations have to be had in order to see what the value is of doing this, right? So I can process this for fingerprints, I can process this for DNA, but how is that going to result in the case of your investigation? And if people hear those conversations, they think, oh, they're just picking and choosing what they think is important, whereas really we're trying to process the scene to the best of our ability with the information that we've received at that moment.
So you would have to explain that every time you testified of
Yes.
why you did what you did. And I'm pretty sure they already ask you that stuff, and they ask you why you don't do certain techniques or practices that we might not have here.
Right. And we can, for the most part, if you're asking me of forensic relevance, I could tell you, the type of service and what type of chemical processing I would use. But if you're talking about, why ultimately did the detective not tell me to process this, then really that conversation needs to come from the detective, because that's part of his investigation. But if that's on a body cam, then, was that bias introduced? And it's not bias, right? We're processing it based on what the detective has and the information we have. And so having that body cam kind of just prevents the conversations to be had in a way that is really, truly beneficial for the investigation, but I don't think people would necessarily think of it as being beneficial.
I could see how that would have the potential to be twisted and used against what we're trying to accomplish. Now, what about job enrichment? Do you guys have the recruits come ride with you when they're on training at all?
We do. So our patrol, they go on our day shift. So they're usually with one of our 3 sworn, and they'll cycle through.
Yeah, because I've been here for about an hour now in this interview, and I've learned a ton already of stuff that I didn't know and I think would be hugely important in the education portion that we're trying to accomplish. You've done a fantastic job so far of explaining a lot of the stuff that we didn't even know was possible. So I think that's a big deal, and they probably need to ride out on evenings and nights too to find out what you guys do there, because there's obviously differences in what's going on at different times of day.
Right. I mean, absolutely. And I think, with the D-Track, the new investigator training, that's something that was really the focus, was to provide this information and provide the gaps of the investigative process to ensure that everybody's kind of receiving the same information, right? So patrol isn't going to that. I mean, I think there's some patrol officers that can voluntarily go through the course, but really, from the crime scene standpoint, we're just hoping to bridge that gap, right? We want to ensure that there is no miscommunication, and the services that crime scene can offer is provided to everybody. But then also, what are the limitations, right? Like, what are we able to provide? And I think really that D-Track training has, it's still pretty new in the process, but I think ultimately the process of it, I think, will be very beneficial.
Just going back to the body camera thing for just a second, my biggest worry with that would be having been in that scene, having stood there, and we're having conversations about some of the evidence that's been found, and then you start getting theories about what happened in that scene, and that theory may ultimately turn out to be wrong. And if that's captured on body camera, now we've got a problem on the stand of, well, you thought this at the scene, but now you're saying this. So them having the body cam, I wouldn't be a huge fan of.
Just on the flip side of that, you could also argue of, yes, we did look at different things. We were trying to consider everything, and this is what the facts and the evidence pointed us towards.
Yeah, that's a valid point as well.
What are you an expert witness?
It depends on how they will classify you, but I have been provided as expert witness and shooting reconstruction specifically. It kind of just depends on what, but they do consider us expert witnesses for crime scene when we testify.
I know it varies, but generally, what are you usually attacked on whenever you're on the stand?
Sometimes they really don't have much, right? And so at that point, they're trying to find anything that kind of just discredits you a little bit.
Of course. Yeah.
And it could be something very petty. I know I testified for this one trial, and I processed this car for hours. I know that there was nothing left in that car that I could have done. I did trace evidence, I did DNA collection, fingerprints, and this defense attorney kept asking me about processing a fake leather purse. And I left, and I was so mad because I'm thinking logistically, I swabbed it for DNA. There was not going to be a fingerprint on a fake leather purse, and I just kept thinking about it. But he did his job as a defense attorney, right? That was one item that I didn't fingerprint. And it was something that he could just trip me up on.
Like, aha.
Yeah. And it was like, oh, man, I've fingerprinted a leather purse every single time since, just to say I did it.
That is their role, though. It's a lot of it's smoke and mirrors, and that's how we get attacked, too. Yeah, sometimes you have to polish a turd, and that's usually what they're working with.
Yeah, and you can't really blame them because they're ultimately there just to poke holes in the investigation, right? They want to ensure that they're providing whatever case it is to their defendant, regardless if their defendant is a POS or not, right? Like, that is what they're trying to do. But, on our standpoint, is they really want to make sure that the integrity was maintained, right? So if there is, lapse of who entered, who manipulated evidence, where did it go, how did you process it? Did you process it fully, right? Did you half-ass it? Anything like that. That's kind of where we're going to get tripped up on is somebody not being able to defend their methods.
Courtney, you've been at this for a long time. You've worked tons of cases. Are there any cases that kind of stand out to you as disturbing?
So knowing that this question was going to come up, and you and I have discussed in the car the one night is in our field, we compartmentalize, right? That's kind of the way that we work through things. And a lot of us in our field have a very analytical brain, right? We want to have an answer and a reason for something to happen. And when we can't provide that answer, that is usually the cases that affect us. So a case where there's no reason or an answer to why that crime would have occurred, those are the cases that are usually harder to, push down because you just want to understand how something like that could have happened to somebody. Whereas, we're going to these other calls and you're going from like a gang shooting to a gang shooting, you're going to drug activities, right? In our mind, we've justified the call, whatever kind of call it is. But when we When we can't, those are the scenes that are harder for us to process. And normally those are cases that have a true victim, which usually children are true victims, right? They're usually not, you're looking at 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds. They're not responsible for what was happening to them, right? I've worked deaths of children being left in cars, right? And you think, how could you leave your child in the car? I mean, I know personally I could never leave mine because even as an infant, she talked my ear off. And so I know I would never leave my child in a car. But then you think, okay, how did this happen, right? And you try to justify the reasoning behind it. But ultimately, what you're looking at is a deceased child who was left to suffer in a car. And I think, not having the reason why is really the cases that get to, I would say it would be kind of even safe for the investigation purpose for investigators and detectives. The same kind of mindset is, we want to understand how it happened. And when we can't, then those are the cases that stick with you. Because we can't answer those questions. So, I mentioned the the death of a car, but really anything with a child is usually pretty tragic because they're usually just there. It's either the wrong place at the wrong time. I've worked a shooting where 2 parents got in an argument with somebody at a gas station, and the individual opened fire, and the little girl was in the back seat, and she got shot straight in the head, right? She had nothing to do with that crime. And honestly, you can't even really fault the parents at that point, right? The parents weren't involved in a firearm disturbance. They're involved in an altercation that led to a tragic accident of their child. And kind of trying to wrap your head around that justification or, why were the parents out at 11 p.m. at night, right? And again, you're trying to place blame where there's really no blame. Right? We've all been traveling with our child at night. We've all been out, in different areas. Then you look at, oh, maybe they're not from here. Maybe they don't know where they were at. And again, it's kind of that I can't provide a reason to it, so it's affecting me more negative than these other cases that I can provide a justification for it. So I think anything with the children aspect of it, when you're looking at cases with the elderly, it's the exact same, right? As at a certain point, the life cycle kind of goes full circle, right? So at a certain point, the elderly aren't responsible for their well-being, right? At a certain point, you're looking and you're hoping that somebody else is going to take care of them. And when you go in and I'm processing a elderly abuse and they have maggots in their diapers, right? They're not necessarily deceased, but how do you allow somebody that you love to get to that point in life? And so again, there's no reason for it, right? There's no answer. So those are the cases that kind of really stick with you. I think, truly out of the hundreds, if not thousands of calls I've responded to, with deaths involved, there's probably only 10 or 15 that really truly stick out to me. And it's because of the true victim mentality associated with it. I worked a bludgeoning call in Florida, and it was probably one of the most horrific scenes I've ever worked. Because that this guy fought for his life the entirety of his call. Right? We don't know exactly how long. There's no witnesses. There's no video evidence. But that this guy fought for his life, and he probably just came home at the wrong time, right? It's broad daylight. It wasn't, a nighttime robbery. He probably just came home, maybe potentially came to people burglarizing his house, and he ended up being bludgeoned to death. Right? He was a gun owner, right? You think of all the things, like he had everything in his purview to save himself, and nothing could save him. So those are the cases that really, really stick with you, because you also think, what else could I have done to bring justice to these people, right? Whereas the other cases, you think justice has kind of already been served. But these ones that, you're looking at this true victim is, what else can I do? How else can I help this case? And sometimes there's just not an answer. And those are definitely the most difficult aspects of them.
Have you worked at, I know you have, but some high profile cases you can talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. Working for the sheriff's office, I worked a officer involved shooting. There was a deputy involved shooting. And it was a high profile nature because a lot of times with, officer involved shootings, deputy involved shootings, a lot of it is you're looking at was the immediate threat present in order for the officer to discharge their weapon. This case specific, it was a individual who had been stalking somebody at a Walmart. He had a big butcher knife. He gets in his car. The officers try to stop him. And at the time, he floors the car towards the officer. So it was an officer shooting into a moving vehicle, which is usually a pretty hot topic for police-involved shootings, because you're always thinking, was there a way for them to protect themselves by means other than deadly force? In this specific case, the individual who was driving the car, he actually didn't get killed. He's a paraplegic, and the case went to multiple trials. They found no fault at the officers ultimately, but I was called to do expert testimony for the shooting reconstruction aspect, to provide information of how the bullets entered the car, at what angle, potentially what bullets entered the suspect, and ultimately, who was at fault for his condition. I don't think anybody was at fault for his condition, because I think he was a little wacky, but ultimately now he's a paraplegic and they wanted to place blame on somebody. So those kind of cases are pretty difficult because, again, we're there to just present the truth, right? I truly, I never actually watched the video. I don't know which officer fired which weapon. I don't know which one entered the suspect, but I'm there to tell you the facts of the trajectory. And if that benefits one person or another, that's kind of our most difficult aspect, is I'm there as an unbiased opinion. And especially with, officer-involved shootings, is I don't know how my opinion is going to affect the course of the investigation. Whereas you're already looking at these very heightened emotions, right? You have the patrol officers are on scene, right? That's their friend. I've listened to my patrol officer friends get shot in the line of duty. I've listened to the radios happen at the exact same time, and then I've still had to have gone and work the scene with that very subjective opinion, right? Like, you go there and you think, okay, this is my friend. I hope there was no wrongdoing, but that's also irrelevant to why I'm here. And I think that's probably with those like high-profile cases, especially police-involved shootings, the sensitivity that we're having to deal with. The police response is over in a few minutes, whereas we're out there for hours to finish it. And so I think that emotional detachment becomes really difficult in those cases. And you have to remove yourself from all outcomes and from all scene processing of it. Because if not, then we are no longer subjective. We have bias, and that's what we're trying to do, is eliminate as much bias as we can.
And that kind of segues into my next topic, as far as how do you in this function of a department in crime scene, how do you process all the trauma and the tragedy and the exposure to violence from a wellness standpoint?
I mean, honestly, I think most individuals in our field do a pretty poor job of taking care of themselves. You don't really talk about it. You kind of compartmentalize everything in, because the appearance of being weak or the appearance of allowing these scenes to negatively affect you, you feel like it kind of diminishes your credibility, right? Like, if this scene affected her, what is that next scene going to affect her? Is she going to make it through? Or is she going to be able to, subjectively process that scene without any problems? So I think naturally our instincts is to keep it in, to not talk about it. Most recently with the death of Officer Burke, that was probably one of the very first calls that we had probably more open conversations about it in the office, because of, how tragic it was. But in the history of the officer-involved shootings that I've worked, or, some of these mass shootings, mass casualties, we don't really talk about it. You keep it in. You might tell somebody like, oh yeah, that was a hard one. And then you continue on. I would say that we don't have a very good mental health aspect with our field in general. It's kind of that stigma that's associated with it, was keep it in. I think with conversations and, something like the wellness unit, I think it provides some value into kind of opening up those conversations that I don't really think exist.
Well, yeah, speaking of Officer Burke's murder and that shooting, the following week we had like a psych ed here in this very room. And we kind of just wanted to give, I think education and awareness is crucial to having these conversations and breaking stigmas, because in law enforcement, any first responder or military, we have the same stigmas too, of pack it down, process it, shove it away the best we can. And a lot of times that's it. And, shove something away, weeks, months later, you find out you didn't really pack it away so well, and it starts seeping out, and that's where we fall into we can go down a bad path of self-destruction. And that's why bringing up awareness and education is what we really try to do here.
And I think, something that is really big is a case that affects one person is not going to be a case that affects the next. And, we look at high-profile shootings, we look at these mass murders, and you think this is going to negatively affect you. But really, a lot of times the calls that are affecting people are the run-of-the-mill. Somebody had just lost their personal grandma, and then they're going and, they're working a death investigation, right? It could be something so simple as, no criminal intent, somebody was found, but you immediately have that connection of, oh my gosh, is this how my grandma was just found, right? So people have that emotional connection. And so again, it's, I think we really focus on these high profile cases, but that's not where the mental wellness really needs to come from, right? It needs to come from the overall that we're spending hours and hours, processing these very sensitive scenes. And, I recently actually had an officer on a scene say that was his first murder in like 4 years. He hadn't been on one. And I think, oh, well, we just processed 6 last month, right? Or, you're thinking about your frequency and then how far removed others can be from that same exact process.
Well, it's the same as like when a lot of they don't make the news. They don't make any, command staff emails, just like a blurb on a one line, infant death, a co-sleeping issue. And you have to go and process a baby at Medical City, and you move on.
Yeah, and that's what it is. It's another call for service, right? And we're taught, in one shift, you could have 3 or 4 of those very sensitive calls for service, but you're just going from call to call, right? The demand of the city is there. Your job is still there, and there's not really the expectation of, okay, you just had a sensitive call, we're going to give you a break. That doesn't exist because the demand for the city is still present.
So you're able to compartmentalize and deal with a lot of this very matter-of-factly, and you're used to dealing mainly with police officers and, interacting with us. But there's another group that you interact with on a regular basis. You teach a forensic anthropology course. How does your attitude towards what goes on here come off to those students?
This is actually pretty funny because last night I taught in my class last night, and the story of Jeff in the freezer came up. And I don't know if y'all know about Jeff in the freezer. He was killed. The case has been to trial. That guy's actually about to be released from prison recently. But it was an Uber driver. He claims that he doesn't kill him. He claims that he finds him dead in a motel room, takes his ID, uses his wallet for a while, then realizes, oh, someone's going to think that I killed him. So he went back, he chopped him up, he bought a deep freezer, and he lived with him for about a year.
Reasonable, yeah.
My next thought process, what I was going to do. So the guy's body was in a deep freezer. The guy's head was in his main fridge freezer, and he lived with him for a year. And I'm bringing this up to my students because we were talking about saw marks, chop marks, and then we were talking about bone trauma and how, for an investigative standpoint, that we know the guy was chopped up, but ultimately the case became kind of a standstill because the medical examiner couldn't prove that there were stab wounds that caused his death, right? We know that he was chopped, right, because he was in 12 different pieces, but we couldn't prove, or the medical examiner, they couldn't prove that he was actually killed by lethal force of some sort. So I'm trying to tell it to my students, and one of my students, they were like, well, can we look up the current case? I said, yeah, the guy's in jail, y'all can look at it. They pull it up, and he goes, or the student goes, is this the victim? And I looked at it, and I kind of got the chuckles, and I said, I don't really remember. He had a lot of frostbite. And I meant it very matter-of-factly, I truly didn't get to see what his face looked like. And they were like, that was so sick. And I was like, no, but I'm being serious. Like, he was in the freezer for a year. His face was very contorted at that point. If he wasn't gray and white. He was in the freezer because of the frostbite. And so the students kind of got that side, and I try to kind of remove it. I tried to not be insensitive because I don't know their histories. I don't know what their life experiences are. But also when something that comes up, it's very clear that I have taken this aspect of my life and made it, separate from what normal people are really exposed to. They don't know that side, right? They're so far removed from thinking of a head in a freezer. And that my first thought process was, of course, I don't remember what he looked like. He had frostbite, right? And then they're thinking like, how do you not know what the victim looked like? He was a victim. And I was like, oh gosh. So little things like that, I mean, it kind of brings you back full circle to realize that
what we do isn't normal.
It is, right? And in order for us to process it, we all say that if you go on a homicide scene, this is probably why we should never have body cams, is we're sick individuals just to process the scene mentally to get through it, right? We have to make those jokes. We have to downplay what we're seeing, not the severity of the scene itself, but of how we're going to be emotionally attached to that scene in order to make it through.
No, it is. We are a different breed, and our mind has to be. But there are better ways to process and pack it away and cope. I want to get into a topic that I know is going to be very sensitive for everybody here. Carmen Fletcher, can you talk about? First I want to say that this episode is going to be dedicated to her.
Yeah. So September 6th, we lost one of our analysts.
Talking about these incidents, and it does show the human side of everybody. I mean, we just over the past hour and a half, we've heard from a true professional that sees the most horrific things in society, in the worst side of humanity, and processes it incredibly, and does her job incredibly effective to help others. Then you sprinkle in tragedies like this that hit very close to home.
Yeah, and I think you think about your job here, and you think, these are the people that I spend hours upon hours with, right? There's some weeks that I spend more time with them than I see my own family. So when we lost Michelle, we give her a hard time because her name's Carmen Fletcher on paper, but depending on what uniform she was in that day, it was either Michelle Gonzalez. So I used to call her Carmen Michelle Gonzalez Fletcher. That was her name on paper to me. And the night that we lost Michelle was something that I don't think really many people can prepare you for, and especially in the forensic community, is really, as far as I'm aware of, there hasn't really been many forensic units that have lost somebody. She's somebody that, you work with, 60, 70 hours a week. There's not really a variation, right? When I come in on a Sunday night that it's going to be me and Michelle. And, from a supervisor standpoint, Michelle is who you wanted as an employee, and so not that it makes it any more justifiable one way or another, but you look at the true tragic loss of an innocent life, and then you look at the true loss that a department's going to feel. The loss of Michelle, it was honestly amazing to see, DPD as a whole come together, because, one thing from being in a civilian is, I've worked officer's death. How the department reacts to an officer's death. And honestly, what we did not know was, how is DPD going to react to a civilian death who is doing a job alongside the officers? And in all honesty, I think DPD set the standard for the treatment of civilian professional staff. It's something that I bragged to my former agency about. We even had a lot of our surrounding agencies come and, support us. And even them, that was their first reaction is, wow, they really, really took care of her. And it was amazing. It really was, because we didn't know how that was going to look, right? And of course, Joe, you took me to the hospital that night. And one of the very first things, walking around that corner and seeing the amount of chain of command for staffing that we had there was probably one of the most impactful things that I could see. Because you know that she's being respected for her, and she's deserving of it. And I think at the hospital, having that support, obviously it meant a lot to the family, because the family is aware that she has devoted her time to this unit for the years that she's been here, right? How many family functions has she missed because she was working homicides for the city of Dallas? So kind of to see that support back was honestly something that I really didn't expect, but it was amazing to see. Even the coming days after, we unfortunately had an officer-involved shooting the next night, and I remember seeing Major Hawks out there, and they immediately came up and said, "How are you?" And I was like, "Let's just not talk. If we can just not talk, we'll get through this scene. We can talk about our feelings later, but we're not going to talk about our feelings. We're going to get through the scene." And the amount of officers in the coming days, people I've never had any conversations with, just coming forward and saying, "Man, we knew Michelle. She was an amazing person," or "We loved her on scene," and I just remember we worked multiple homicides coming the few days after Michelle's death. And I just remember telling all of them, "I would love to hear your stories about Michelle. Come tell me them after we finish this scene," right? I need to, again, we need to compartmentalize. I need to remove myself from that emotional aspect. But the amount of support that came from everybody in DPD, it was truly amazing to see. Her funeral services were just beautiful. She was well respected, and I think all aspects of it through the entire chain of command really kind of presented her in that light, that she was a valuable individual for this department, and that her loss is, greatly felt. She's not replaceable. A position has to be filled, but she's not replaceable. And I think that really kind of was evident that week.
Yeah, I have to say that I'm very proud of this department's response that night. The hospital staying there for hours, and then the family coming in, and Michelle is Chief Cato's niece. Chief Cato left here as a 3-star chief, and now he's the DART chief of police. And to see Charlie crushed like that was heartbreaking, because I've known him my entire career. He was a brand new sergeant when I heard on. I had to say that I was, I'm glad that, when you called me that night and I answered, I was like, that's kind of odd, her calling on a Friday night, because the next day was Burks' funeral, and we were all, wellness unit was kind of gearing up for that, because we knew we were going to be busy for that. And you called me, and I'm like, this is odd. What's going on? And you told me, and I was, because just a couple of days prior, we had all of you in this very room for a education class, and she was in here. And I answered the phone, and I could tell you were emotional, and I was like, oh no, what happened? And then we just, the night played out into the, 3 or 4 a.m. But I have to say that I want to give a kudos to you as a supervisor and a true leader.
Thank you. It was, again, it's not, anything that we can ever really be prepared for. And if you would have ever asked me if that's something I thought I was going to be signing up for, I don't think it was ever going to be there. It was honestly an honor to be able to show the respect that I was able to throughout the entire process. I'm not sure I ever want to do it again, because, obviously someone like Michelle, again, she's not replaceable. She was an amazing human, inside and out, and she was a very integral part of our office, and her loss is felt on everybody, right? Not just on the midnight watch that worked with her, everybody involved. She's gone, in that gap, it cannot be filled.
So there's a train of thought, or almost a philosophy of leadership, to where you separate yourself from your employees, right? And I was told that early on is you don't really want to become friends with your subordinates, right? Part of it is it's difficult to discipline your friends. but I've always subscribed to the opposite of, I need to know my people, right? I need to understand who they are and why they are. And I see that you've kind of taken that same deal, and that makes it a little bit more difficult, but it makes you a better leader in the end. And I think that you attributed that earlier to the people that you worked for when you were still coming up some. So take solace in the fact that you did an excellent job as a leader. I think Joe hit it on the head, but it's much more difficult to deal with things like that, and even just the day-to-day operations of supervising friends. But I think number one, if they're truly your friend, they're going to work harder for you than they would if you were just their boss, right? So that makes it a little bit easier for you as a leader. But also, everything that you've discussed so far today, as far as everybody sings your kudos for doing the job that you should allow other people to do sometimes. As the boss, you're not supposed to be hands into everything, but you still do it. And that's why your people work hard for you. So great job on that.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
And I can say, from having spent multiple hours out on scenes with Courtney and her crew on deep nights, that you can see Courtney's influence on that group, how professional they are, how good they are at their job, and how seriously they take their job. So great job.
Thank you. I guess lastly, I just want to kind of acknowledge the, First Watch employees. That's ultimately who I'm supervising over, and they've been a big impact on my life, and we've, gone through a lot of scenes. So I just kind of want to acknowledge everybody on First Watch and, the pivotal role that they play in, both for the city of Dallas as well as my role as a supervisor.
Yeah, I had I got to meet quite a few of them that week after Burke's murder and then Michelle's death. And I want to say this on here, and I've said this to you and your team before, that we want to be here for you moving forward as much as we can and as much as you need us. So please, we're here. Use us. Okay?
Absolutely.
What message do you want to leave the listeners with regarding how this vital role of crime scene plays in bringing a suspect to justice and giving victims some semblance of the job was done, and your unit worked alongside the law enforcement community to make that happen?
This is a tough question. Because I think ultimately, our role in crime scene is, or, in forensics really, is to provide that visual component that doesn't necessarily exist for viewers who aren't present on a scene, right? We're there to help make that visualization so someone can understand the true nature of the crime that occurred. Through the collection of the evidence, through photographs, through scans, whatever it is, and then the analysis and the interpretation of that evidence that then aids to the investigation. Ultimately, I like to say that we're truly a voice for the truth. And I think that's the biggest message that I want to put forth is, we're there to be a voice, whether, that helps one way or another. It could help the victim, but sometimes it could not help the victim, right? And I think really for crime scene and for forensic process as a whole is that we're a voice for the truth, however that truth actually plays out through the investigation process.
Hey brother, hey sister, I'll never give up on you. Hey Mrs., hey mister, I'll see this all the way through. No matter how far the sun and the moon, I'll never give up on you. Down when you're lonely, I'll pull you up. Life leaves you heavy when the going gets tough. I'll be your shoulder, together we'll run. Up from the bottom, yeah, we'll rise above. Hey brother, hey sister, I'll never give up on you. Hey Mrs., hey mister, I'll see this all the way through. No matter how far the sun and the moon, I'll never give up on you. Hey Mrs., hey mister, I'll see this all the way through. No matter how far, for the gold and the blue, I will never give up on you.